When the smoke clears inside the Meridian Grand Hotel, only one question will matter. Who did Adrian Voss choose to save? In a single moment of chaos, fire, and collapsing power, the most feared man in the city reveals what he truly values. His wife Elena, the woman who built him from nothing, or Vivian, the secret he never gave up. What happens next will shake an entire empire to its foundation. Watch until the end. You won't believe how this ends. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The Meridian Grand had stood at the center of Caldwell City for 40 years, and in that time it had absorbed the weight of more secrets than any building had a right to hold. Its marble floors had been walked by senators and smugglers alike, its chandeliers casting the same indifferent light over fundraiser galas and backroom handshakes that never made it into any official record. It was the kind of place that understood discretion the way a good lawyer did, instinctively, completely, and without needing to be asked. On the night of the Caldwell Financial Summit, the hotel was dressed for performance, every surface polished, every staff member in pressed black. The guest list ran 400 names deep and included the city's most bankable faces, tech executives who moved money like weather systems, property developers who'd turned whole neighborhoods into something unrecognizable, politicians whose public salaries didn't begin to explain their lifestyles. They moved through the Meridian's grand ballroom in clusters, trading information wrapped in pleasantries, everyone knowing that the real business of the evening happened in the margins, in the quiet corners, in the brief handshakes that lasted 2 seconds too long. Adrian Voss knew this better than anyone. He stood near the east end of the ballroom's upper mezzanine, one hand resting on the brass rail, a glass of scotch in the other that he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. From here, he could see the entire room in a single sweep. The exits, the crowd patterns, the 6 security personnel he'd placed himself at intervals around the perimeter. He'd insisted on his own people alongside the hotel's standard detail. The summit's organizers had pushed back. He hadn't cared. This was not a man who attended events without a plan for leaving them. Adrian Voss was 44 years old and carried those years in a particular way. Not soft, not worn down, but compressed. His face had the kind of stillness that made people around him straighten their posture without knowing why. He was not the largest man in the room, not the loudest, but he occupied space differently than other men, and almost everyone in the ballroom was aware of exactly where he was at any given moment, even if they were pretending not to look. His suit was charcoal and expensive without advertising itself. His hair was dark with silver threading through the temples. The only thing about him that didn't project absolute control was his eyes, which moved constantly, scanning, cataloging, never fully at rest. He was watching a conversation happening 40 feet below him between a city councilman named Breck and a property developer named Harlan Souza when he felt her presence before he heard her. "You've been watching Souza for 10 minutes, Elena said. She came to stand beside him at the rail, not touching him, but close enough that he could smell the faint trace of her perfume. It was the same one she'd worn for 12 years. He'd never told her he noticed. Elena Marlowe Voss was 39. She had the posture of someone who had learned early that rooms full of powerful people required a specific kind of armor, and she had built hers quietly and carefully over the years, until it had become simply the way she moved through the world. Dark dress, hair pulled back, nothing about her appearance was accidental. Everything about her was considered. "Souza's been talking to Reinhold's people," Adrian said without looking at her. "I know. He's supposed to be ours." "People realign when they smell weakness," she said. Her voice was even. No accusation in it, just the statement as fact. "Are you worried about what that means?" "I'm never worried." "That's one of the things you say when you're worried." He turned to look at her then. She held his gaze without flinching, which she had always done, which was one of the reasons he'd married her, and one of the reasons she sometimes exhausted him. Elena didn't look away from things. It was a quality he'd found useful and inconvenient in almost equal measure. "Stay close tonight," he said. "I'm always close." "Closer than that?" Something shifted behind her eyes, brief and controlled. She nodded, once, and moved away along the mezzanine. He watched her go for 3 seconds, then turned back to the ballroom. 40 minutes later, everything came apart. The first sign was the smell. Not smoke yet, but something chemical underneath the air conditioning, sharp and wrong. A smell that didn't belong inside a marble ballroom with 400 people and enough ventilation to keep the heat from the bodies from building. Adrian caught it mid-breath and felt his entire nervous system shift into a different gear before his conscious mind had processed the input. He was already moving toward the staircase when the lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a gradual dim. All of it, at once. Every chandelier and sconce and accent light in the grand ballroom dropping to absolute black in the same instant, which meant it wasn't a blown breaker, which meant it was deliberate, which meant someone had cut the main feed or overridden the system, which meant the screaming started on the main floor before the emergency generators kicked in, casting the ballroom in the flat amber of backup lighting, and in that sudden amber, Adrian could see the first tendrils of smoke beginning to pour through the ventilation grates along the west wall. Not fire. Not yet. But something burning in the infrastructure, filling the ducts, and whoever had designed this had designed it to fill the room before the alarms even registered, which told him this wasn't amateur work. He had his phone out and his earpiece in before he'd taken 3 steps. "Marcus, talk to me." Static. Then, "West corridor is blocked. Something in the walls, it's chemical smoke, not fire, but it's thick. Cameras are down on floors 2 through 5. We've got at least 2 external doors that won't open. The locking mechanisms are... Who's in the building?" "Can't confirm. I've got 3 men unaccounted for." 3 of his own men, unaccounted for, in a building with locked exits and chemical smoke. Adrian's jaw tightened. He pressed the earpiece deeper. "Get the east emergency exit open. Get people moving. Now!" The crowd below was transitioning from confusion to panic with the efficiency that 400 frightened people in a sealed space usually manage, which was to say badly and quickly. He could see the surge beginning, bodies pressing toward the exits that weren't opening, voices rising, someone near the center of the floor stumbling and nearly going down, the crowd not stopping for them. Adrian moved down the staircase at controlled speed, not running, because running in a panicking crowd created vectors that got people killed, but moving with purpose and with his shoulder forward and his weight ready. And as he hit the main floor, the smoke was already thickening along the ceiling line, building pressure downward. He pulled his jacket over his nose and kept moving. He was halfway across the ballroom toward the east corridor when his phone lit up with a text from a number he didn't have saved, but recognized immediately, and the recognition hit him somewhere below the sternum, cold and immediate. "3rd floor, room 318, now. I'm locked in. Vivian." He stopped walking. The smoke was pouring denser now, and somewhere in the building something structural groaned. Not collapse? Not yet, but warning, the building announcing what was coming, and the crowd was fully panicking, 400 people compressing toward every exit in every direction, and through the amber backup light and the gray chemical haze, Adrian could see his security team trying to push people toward the east corridor, trying to establish order in something that had already stopped being orderly. His earpiece crackled. Marcus again. "East emergency exit is clear. People are moving. Adrian, where are you?" He didn't answer immediately. He was standing still in the middle of a panicking ballroom, and the text on his phone was 1 sentence. And that sentence was pulling him in a direction that every calculation in his head was telling him was wrong. Because 3rd floor meant going up, and up meant deeper into a building that was filling with chemical smoke with blocked exits and a compromised security system. But the number was Vivian's number. Vivian Cross had been in his life for 14 months. She was 32, worked in financial consulting at a firm he partially controlled, and the relationship had begun the way these things always did. Gradually, then suddenly, and by the time Adrian had understood what he was doing, it had already become something he didn't know how to stop. She was not a good decision. He knew that with the same certainty he knew his own name. She was also, somehow, a decision he kept making. He turned toward the staircase. He told himself it was because Vivian didn't have the contacts, the training, the internal knowledge of how these situations worked. Elena had survived difficult situations before. Elena knew his people, knew the protocols, knew how to move. Vivian was locked in a room on the 3rd floor of a building that was filling with smoke, and if he didn't go, he told himself that. And he moved toward the stairs, and somewhere in the part of him that tracked his own choices with cold accuracy, he noted the gap between what he was telling himself and what was actually happening. The stairwell was choked with people moving down, and he pushed through them going the opposite direction, taking the impacts on his shoulders, keeping his head down. one hand against the wall for orientation as the smoke thickened. His eyes were burning. His lungs were taking inventory of what they were pulling in and filing complaints. Third floor. He hit the door and pushed through into the corridor. The hallway had emergency lighting, thin strips of red along the baseboards, and the smoke here was thinner, most of it still building in the floors below. He moved fast down the corridor, counting doors. 318 was 2/3 of the way down. He tried the handle. Locked. Vivian? He knocked once, hard. Movement inside. Then her voice close to the door. Adrian? Step back from the door. He hit the lock with his shoulder twice, and on the second impact the old brass mechanism gave and the door swung inward. Vivian was standing 3 feet back, exactly as he told her, which meant some part of her had managed to stay functional even through the fear, and she was in the green dress she'd been wearing when he'd seen her an hour ago in the second-floor lounge. The meeting he hadn't been supposed to have. The 8 minutes he'd told himself were administrative. The lie he'd been telling himself for 14 months. And her face was composed in the way people's faces get when they've been crying and then stopped, when they've moved past fear into something quieter and more focused. Are you hurt? He said. No. Can you move? Yes. He took her arm and moved her into the corridor. She didn't ask questions, didn't pull back, didn't do any of the things that would have cost them time. He gave her his jacket and put his arm around her shoulders and moved her toward the stairwell. It took 11 minutes to get her out of the building, through the east exit, into the cold air of the service alley on the hotel's north side. 11 minutes that he marked in his head against everything else that was happening in the building. When they came through the door into the cold and the noise, sirens now, multiple units, fire department and police, and the particular chaos of a major incident response spreading outward from the hotel's front entrance. He handed her to Marcus, who was standing at the alley entrance with 2 of Adrian's men. Get her somewhere safe, he said. Off-site. Don't use the main cars. Marcus looked at him. Elena. The word dropped into Adrian's chest like a stone into still water. He'd stopped moving. He'd come through the building. He'd crossed the panicking ballroom, gone up against the crowd flow, gone to the 3rd floor. He'd gone to Vivian. Where's Elena? He said. I don't know, Marcus said, and his voice had a quality in it that Adrian had learned to read in 15 years of working together, which was the quality of a man who was being careful not to say something directly. I had people looking. When the crowd hit critical, I had to redirect everyone to the east exit. I haven't been able to reach her. Adrian's body was already turning back toward the building. The door behind them opened again, and 3 more people came through. Hotel staff, one holding his arm at an angle that suggested a shoulder injury, and Adrian registered them the way he registered everything in a crisis, peripherally, with the part of his mind that tracked exits and threats and status, while the main channel of his attention had locked onto a single thought. He had gone up. He had not looked for Elena. He had known she was in the building, in the crowd, in the smoke, and he had gone up. Marcus caught his arm. Adrian, there are fire units going in. They don't know her face. I'm going back in. That door won't open from the outside in 60 seconds. The emergency lockdown. Adrian pulled free and lunged for the door and caught it a half second before it sealed, the magnetic lock slamming home against his forearm as he wedged himself into the gap, the pain clean and irrelevant, and pushed through. The ballroom was nearly empty now. The smoke had dropped to chest height and was still building. The amber emergency lights made the haze look orange, turned the whole space into something that felt like the inside of a failing lung. He could hear the fire department moving on the far side of the building, the organized shouts and the sound of equipment, and he moved through the thinning crowd remnants, the people who'd been slow or trapped or who'd fallen. He found Elena at the far end of the main corridor off the ballroom's west exit. She was on her feet. That was the first thing he registered and the thing he'd remember later, that she was already on her feet, not collapsed, not unconscious, standing with her hand flat against the wall and her head forward and her breathing labored but controlled. The smoke was thicker here, and she'd pulled the collar of her dress up over the lower half of her face, and she had her phone in her other hand. She heard him before she saw him. She turned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Her eyes above the makeshift face covering were clear, and they were doing what her eyes always did, which was take inventory, assess, measure. She looked at him the way she might look at a set of numbers that didn't quite add up. "I couldn't reach you," he said. She said nothing. "Your phone. My phone was working," she said. 3 words, clean and flat. He felt them the way he felt the smoke in his lungs, present, inescapable, something his body was processing even while his mind tried to find its footing. "We need to get out," he said. "Yes." She straightened and moved away from the wall. Her legs were steady. She'd always been steady. He reached for her arm, and she let him take it, which was not the same as accepting it, a distinction he didn't fully understand yet, but that he would come to understand in the weeks ahead, when he had more time to examine the specific quality of her permission. They moved toward the east corridor, and Adrian kept his hand on her arm, and the smoke burned in his chest, and somewhere behind him the building continued to announce its distress, and they walked out into the cold together. Outside, in the full organized chaos of 4 fire units and a dozen police cruisers, and the beginning of the media circle that would always form around a disaster of this scale, he saw Marcus standing with Vivian near the second black car, and he watched Elena see them. Her eyes moved from Vivian in his jacket to Adrian's face. The look lasted less than 2 seconds. Then she looked away. "I need a moment," she said, which was what she said when she needed considerably more than a moment, but had decided not to address something in public. She moved away from him toward the paramedics who were setting up triage near the alley entrance, and Adrian watched her go, and he was aware that several of his own people were watching him watch her, and he was aware that Marcus was not coming over to debrief him, which meant Marcus was giving him space, which was the thing Marcus did when he understood that whatever had happened couldn't be fixed with logistics. He should have gone to her. That was the simple fact of it, stripped of everything else. He should have found Elena. He'd known where she was. In the ballroom, in the crowd, moving toward an exit. She'd been in his building, with his people, and he'd known she could navigate a crisis, and he'd used that knowledge to justify going somewhere else, to someone else. And she had been in that west corridor alone, in the smoke, with her phone that had been working. He stood in the cold in his shirt sleeves and let that sit in him without resolving it, because that was what it required. Some things didn't benefit from being resolved quickly. Some things needed to be felt with accuracy before they could be thought about clearly. The paramedics were checking Elena's oxygen levels. She was sitting now, on the back of an open ambulance, her hands in her lap, her face calm. A young medic was talking to her, and she was listening and nodding with the full attention she gave everything, the attention that had always made people trust her, the attention that he had stopped deserving to be its subject at some point in the last 14 months. Adrian's earpiece clicked. "Marcus. Building is mostly clear. Fire department's calling it controlled in the East Wing. West Wing is still active. They found something in the ductwork. It wasn't an accident. I know it wasn't. There are people talking. The media is already... Some of our guests are talking." Adrian turned away from the ambulance where Elena sat. He turned until he was looking at the hotel's east wall, the concrete and glass of it, the amber emergency light still burning through the upper story windows. "Who knew about this event?" he said. Summit guest list was public. Who knew specifically about the ventilation, the locking systems, the camera blind spots? Silence on the line. Then, "We need to talk about that somewhere that isn't here." "I know." Adrian pressed the earpiece harder. "Keep Vivian off grid tonight. Different location from the others. Don't use anyone who is on security tonight." "Understood." He turned back. Elena was no longer sitting on the ambulance. He scanned the crowd, the gathering, chaotic, camera-lit crowd, and found her standing near the perimeter tape talking to a man in a fire department jacket. Not a random firefighter. The jacket had command markings on the sleeve. A unit chief. Elena was talking to a fire department unit chief, and from the quality of her body language, from the slight forward lean and the focused look, she was not being comforted. She was asking questions. He watched her for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone. The text from Vivian's number was still on the screen. "3rd floor, room 318, now. I'm locked in." He looked at it. He read it again with fresh eyes. Not the eyes of a man responding to a crisis, but the eyes of a man who had time to notice things he hadn't noticed in the moment. The text had come in 6 minutes after the lights went out. 6 minutes. Not 2, not 1. 6. Enough time to know the building was compromised, but not enough time for genuine panic to set in at scale. He had a memory, sudden and specific, of arriving at Vivian's floor. The smoke in the stairwell had been heaviest 2 floors below. At the 3rd floor it had been thin, almost normal. He hadn't thought about that in the moment. He'd been focused on the door, on her voice, on the 11 minutes it had taken to get out. The 3rd floor smoke had been thin. He put the phone in his pocket and looked back at Elena, still talking to the fire command chief, still asking her questions in the calm, thorough way she had. And he felt something move through him that was not quite dread and not quite recognition, but sat somewhere between the two. He didn't know what he was feeling. He'd spent 20 years in situations that required fast decisions and clean thinking, and he'd been good at both, and tonight he'd stood in the middle of a ballroom and made a choice in 12 seconds that he now understood might take considerably longer to reckon with. The city spread out beyond the perimeter tape, indifferent and blazing with its own lights, and somewhere in its structure were the people who had planned this evening, who had understood his building's camera systems and its exit locks and its ventilation ductwork, who had known exactly how to create the kind of chaos that forced choices, and who had, perhaps, understood something about Adrian Voss and his choices that he had not fully understood about himself. He needed to find out who they were. He needed to do it before Elena found out first. He moved through the crowd toward his car, and as he passed the ambulance, he looked once more at the place where Elena had been sitting. The medic was already moving to the next patient. The spot where she'd sat was empty. She had not looked for him before she left. For 12 years, in every situation, she had looked for him before she left. He had not noticed until this moment, standing in the aftermath of smoke and bad choices, that she hadn't. He got in the car. Marcus was already in the front seat. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The driver kept his eyes forward. "She knows," Marcus said finally. Not a question. "She knew before we were outside," Adrian said. "What do you want to do?" The street outside was building with media vehicles now, the satellite trucks and the urgent pedestrian movements of people whose job was to turn other people's worst nights into content. Adrian watched a camera crew set up on the far sidewalk, their lights cutting sharp white circles into the dark. "I want to know who planned this," he said. "Tonight. I want names by morning." "And the other thing?" "The other thing doesn't have a solution yet," Adrian said. "So we start with the thing that does." Marcus nodded. The car moved into traffic. Behind them, the Meridian Grand Hotel stood with its upper story lights still burning amber, the fire department still moving through its corridors, the smoke still drifting from its vents into the cold city air. Somewhere inside that building, in its infrastructure and its systems and its locked and compromised machinery, was the beginning of an answer to a question that Adrian was only now beginning to understand how to ask. And somewhere in the city, Elena Marlowe Voss was in a car that was not his car, with people he had not arranged, going somewhere he did not know, having spoken to a fire commander whose name he hadn't caught, asking questions she hadn't shared with him. For the first time in 12 years of marriage, Adrian Voss did not know where his wife was going. That was the thing that kept him awake as the car moved through the city, more than the smoke still sitting in his lungs, more than the names he needed by morning, more than the certainty settling in his chest that tonight had been engineered, that the chaos had been purposeful, that someone had studied him carefully enough to know exactly which direction he would move when the lights went out. More than any of it, Elena had not looked for him before she left. He had been the one who left first, and she had simply learned from it, immediately, without drama, without confrontation, with the clean efficiency that she brought to everything. She had rearranged the architecture of her survival to no longer include him as a load-bearing wall. He didn't know yet what that meant for what came next. He knew only that it meant something had already changed before he'd had the chance to decide whether he wanted it to. The city moved past the car windows, indifferent and enormous, full of its own machinery, and Adrian Voss sat in the dark and felt, for the first time in longer than he could accurately calculate, the specific weight of a choice he could not take back. The safe house on Delmar Street was a narrow brownstone that Adrian owned through 3 layers of shell companies, and it smelled the way all safe houses smelled, like recycled air and other people's tension and the particular staleness of a space that existed only for emergencies. Marcus had the lights on by the time Adrian arrived, and 2 of the remaining security team were already posted at the ground floor windows, and someone had put coffee on, which meant someone had understood this was going to be a long night. Adrian sat at the table in the back room and did not touch the coffee. He had his phone out and had been looking at Vivian's text for 40 minutes, on and off, in the car, and now here, turning the timing over in his mind the way you turned a stone to find what lived under it. 6 minutes after the lights went out. He kept coming back to 6 minutes. Marcus came in and closed the door and sat across from him without being invited to sit. "Names," Adrian said. "Working on it. Reinhold's people are the obvious pull, but the technical work, cutting the main feed, the locking mechanisms, the ductwork modification, that's not Reinhold. Reinhold uses blunt instruments. So someone with more precision, someone who had access to the hotel systems ahead of time, maintenance staff, contracted security, possibly someone inside the summit's organizing committee." Marcus paused. "Or someone who got the information from inside our operation." The room was quiet enough that Adrian could hear the coffee maker finishing its cycle in the outer room. "How many people knew I was attending tonight?" Adrian said. "Standard circle. 8 people, maybe 10. "And how many of those knew about Vivian?" Marcus didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "Marcus. 3 that I know of, possibly 4. He met Adrian's eyes. "It's been 14 months. People see things." Adrian set the phone down, face up on the table. The text was still visible. He watched Marcus look at it. "The timing," Adrian said. "I noticed." "Say it." Marcus leaned forward and pressed his hands flat on the table, a gesture that meant he was about to say something he'd rather not. 6 minutes is long enough to get to a room, lock yourself in, and send a message. It's not the timing of someone who panicked the moment the lights went out. "She might have been in the room already." "She might have been. She was at the summit. She had a reason to be there." "She had a reason you gave her," Marcus said. "Her firm's consulting contract with Meridian Properties. That's your contract, laundered 2 steps out." "I know what it is." "Then you know she was in that building because of you, in a capacity that you arranged, attending an event that you attend every year." He paused. "And she was on the 3rd floor, which had the thinnest smoke. And she texted you specifically, not the front desk, not emergency services. You." Adrian stood up, not from anger. He didn't move from anger, hadn't for years, but because sitting still had stopped being possible. He moved to the window and looked at the narrow slice of street visible between the curtain panels. A cab moved through the puddle light of a street lamp. "You think she's involved," he said. "I think the timing is worth examining before you decide what you owe her." "I don't decide what I owe people based on suspicion." "No," Marcus said. "You decide based on the feeling you had when you saw that text, and I'm asking you to look at that feeling clearly instead of burying it." Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then, "Find out where she was in the 20 minutes before the lights went out. Specifically. Camera footage, staff accounts, anything." "Already running. And I want to know about the organizing committee for the summit. Every name, every vendor, every contracted service." He turned from the window. "And I want to know where Elena went." Something moved across Marcus's face. "She went home." "Our home?" "The Ashford apartment, the one in her name." Adrian absorbed this. The Ashford apartment was a 2-bedroom on the 14th floor of a building on the east side of the city, a place Elena had kept through their entire marriage as what she called her professional address, somewhere to receive mail, to meet clients from her charity foundation work, to maintain the administrative independence that she'd insisted on before she signed anything with her name attached to his. He'd found it reasonable at the time. He now understood it differently. She had gone to the apartment that was in her name and not his. "Alone?" he said. "With Petra." Petra was Elena's personal assistant, had been for 6 years, a small, meticulous woman in her 50s who communicated in complete sentences and had never once, in 6 years, told Adrian anything about Elena that Elena hadn't authorized her to share. And she made 2 calls in the car. To who? One to her attorney, Marcus said. Daniel Foss. The name landed in the room and stayed there. Daniel Foss did not handle charity foundation work. Daniel Foss did not handle event logistics or real estate or any of the civic committee work that occupied Elena's professional calendar. Daniel Foss handled the kind of legal architecture that preceded the kind of decisions that didn't get made quickly or undone easily. Adrian sat back down. And the second call, he said. We don't have confirmation yet. The number routes through a relay. We're working on it. He nodded slowly. His chest felt like it had something sitting on it, not painful, but present, a pressure that his breathing kept working around rather than through. Elena had called her attorney from the car, within 90 minutes of leaving the Meridian Grand. She had watched him come out of the building with Vivian in his jacket. She had looked at him for less than 2 seconds and looked away. She had sat on the ambulance and not called for him. And then she had gotten into a car that wasn't his and called Daniel Foss. He had spent 40 minutes examining Vivian's text message timing. He had not spent 1 minute thinking about what Elena might do next. That was a mistake of the kind he could not afford, and he felt its shape now with the clarity of something understood too late. The next morning came in slow and gray, the city wrapped in the kind of overcast that made everything look like a photograph of itself. Adrian had not slept. He'd worked through the night with Marcus and 2 analysts, building the network diagram of who'd known what about the summit, who'd had access to which systems, and by 6 in the morning, he had a list of 4 names that appeared in the overlap of too many things to be coincidence. He set the list aside. He had people to verify it. What he could not set aside was the call from Vivian that came at 7:14. He answered it. I need to see you, she said. No greeting. Her voice was different than it had been in the building. The composed focus was gone, replaced by something tighter and less managed. Not at the usual place, somewhere neutral. Are you safe? He said. Yes, I'm at the Kessler, a mid-range hotel on the north side, the kind of place that didn't attract attention. Adrian, there are things I didn't tell you last night. There are things I need to ask you about last night. Silence. Okay, she said. He went to the Kessler at 8. He took his own car, no security, which Marcus objected to and which Adrian overrode because this conversation required a room with 2 people in it and nothing else. The hotel was the kind of place where the lobby carpet was slightly too soft and the lighting was slightly too yellow, and the elevator moved slowly and he stood in it with his hands in his pockets and felt the sleepless night sitting in the backs of his eyes. Room 211. He knocked. Vivian answered immediately, which meant she'd been standing near the door, which meant she was more unsettled than she'd sounded on the phone. She was in different clothes, dark jeans, gray sweater, and her hair was loose, and she looked younger without the summit event presentation around her, younger and more genuinely frightened, and he came in and she closed the door and they stood in the narrow entry of the room, looking at each other. Sit down, he said. I'd rather stand. Vivian? I'm fine standing, Adrian. I've been sitting in this room all night. He moved past her into the room and sat in the chair near the window. She stayed near the door. The distance between them felt different than it usually did. Not the distance of 2 people navigating a complicated intimacy, but the distance of 2 people who were about to have a conversation that one of them was afraid of. Tell me about the text, he said. She crossed her arms. What about it? 6 minutes after the lights went out. I was scared. I was in the room and I didn't know what... You texted me before you called the front desk, he said. Before you called the emergency line that's on every hotel room phone. You texted my private number first. Because you're the person I... Don't, he said quietly. She stopped. He looked at her. He had looked at her many times in 14 months, across restaurants and rooms, and the complicated geography of what they were to each other. And he was now looking at her with different eyes. Not the eyes of what they'd been, but the eyes of a man who had sat up all night counting minutes and building network diagrams. What he saw was not what he'd expected to see, which was guilt or calculation. What he saw was fear, and the fear looked real, but real fear and performed fear could occupy the same face, and he knew better than to read one and call it the other. "Were you in the room before the lights went out?" he said. "Yes." "How long before?" She hesitated. That hesitation was small, but he caught it. 20 minutes? Maybe 25. "Why?" "I had a headache. The room was too loud." "You were at a financial summit to represent your firm's consulting work, and you left the main floor 25 minutes in because of a headache." "I left because I saw Elena," she said. "All right." "I saw her, and I knew you'd seen me, and I didn't want to be in that room watching you manage being in the same space as both of us. So I went upstairs and I sat in the dark with a headache, and then the lights went out and the smoke started coming under the door, and I texted you because you're the only person in that building I trusted." The room was quiet. He sat with what she'd said and let it settle without reacting to it, which was a discipline he'd practiced for years and which did not get easier. "Vivian," he said finally, "did anyone contact you before the summit, in the days before? Any unusual contact, any requests for information, anyone asking about my schedule or attendance?" Her arms dropped slightly. The shift was involuntary. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because I'm asking everyone who was in that building." "That's not why you're asking me." "Answer the question." "No," she said. "No one contacted me. No one asked about you." Her voice had gone from frightened to something sharper. "Is that what you think? That I had something to do with— I think the timing of your text is unusual." "I think you're looking for a reason," she said, and her voice was rising now, controlled but climbing, "to make last night my fault, because if it's my fault, then you don't have to look at what you actually did, which is you walked out of that ballroom and came upstairs to me and left your wife standing in smoke." The words hit the room like a flat surface. Adrian didn't move. Vivian's chest was moving faster, and she was pressing her lips together the way she did when she was trying to pull something back that had already gotten out. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's not—" "Don't apologize for saying a true thing," he said. She looked at him. "I did leave her," he said. "That's accurate. I'm not here to argue that." He stood up. The chair was suddenly insufficient. He moved to the window and looked down at the street below, the ordinary morning traffic, the city going about its business without reference to any of what had happened the night before or was happening now. "I need to know you're not involved in what happened last night. Not because I want to make it your fault, because people who were in that building are at risk, and I need to understand the full picture." "I'm not involved," she said. Her voice had come down. "I swear to you, I'm not." He stood at the window for a long moment. "I'm going to have people verify your movements last night," he said. "Not because I doubt you specifically, because I'm verifying everyone." "Fine. And you need to stay off grid for the next few days. Don't go back to your apartment, don't go to the office, don't use your regular accounts for anything that matters." "Adrian," her voice changed again, and this time it was quieter, and it had something in it that he'd heard before, a frequency that he'd responded to for 14 months, the particular register of her saying his name when she needed him to be something other than operational. "What happens now? With us?" "What?" "I don't know," he said. He said it before he'd decided to say it, and it landed in the room the same way the other truths had landed, flat, without cushion. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the street. "I don't know yet," he said again, "and I won't know until I understand what happened last night." He left the hotel without touching her. He was in the car, heading back toward Delmar Street, when his phone rang. Not Marcus. The number on the screen was Elena's cell, and he stared at it for 2 full rings before he answered. "Elena, I'd like to meet." Her voice was what it always was, level, clear, carrying no ambient emotion in the way some people's voices carried weather. "This afternoon, the Caldwell Room at the Four Seasons, 2 o'clock. You want to meet at—" "A public location, yes." A beat. "I think that's appropriate." The Four Seasons Caldwell Room was where the city's institutional negotiations happened. Contract signings, settlement conversations, the kind of meetings where the setting itself was a message about the register of what was being discussed. He understood the message. I'll be there, he said. She hung up. He set the phone on the seat beside him and looked at the back of his driver's head and said nothing for the rest of the ride. The Caldwell room at 2 o'clock was half full with the usual afternoon crowd. The people who held meetings in hotels because their offices were either too consequential or not consequential enough for what they were discussing. Adrian arrived 8 minutes early and chose a table with clear sightlines to the entrance, which was instinct, and sat with water he didn't drink and waited. Elena was on time. She was always on time. She came through the entrance in a dark coat that she removed at the table, folding it over the chair back with the unhurried precision she brought to every physical action, and she sat and she looked at him. She looked, he thought, like someone who had slept. Not enough, but some. Which meant she was either more resilient than the situation warranted, or she'd already done her grieving somewhere before this meeting, behind the closed door of the Ashford apartment, in the portion of her interior life that he had apparently not been permitted access to for longer than he'd realized. "Thank you for coming," she said. "It's a strange thing to thank me for." "It's the appropriate thing to say." She placed her hands flat on the table. No bag, no notes, nothing that suggested she'd needed to prepare. "I want to ask you something directly, and I want an honest answer." "Okay." "How long?" He held her gaze. 14 months. A small breath, not a flinch, not a reaction of the dramatic kind he might have expected, just the minor physiological acknowledgement of information that confirmed rather than revealed. She had known the approximate truth. He had just given her the precise one. "I want to ask you something else," she said. "Ask?" "Last night, did you go to her before you looked for me, or after?" "Before," he said. He watched her absorb it. Her face didn't change. Her hands on the table stayed still. Only her eyes did something, some interior adjustment, the way a landscape looks different in the 3 seconds after a cloud passes over the sun and before it moves away. "I went back," he said. "When Marcus said, 'I know you went back,'" her voice remained even. "I was already standing when you found me. I wasn't waiting for you. I want you to understand that distinction." He did understand it. He understood it more than she perhaps intended him to. "Elena," he said. "I didn't come here to discuss the marriage," she said. "Not today. I came because there's something you need to know about last night, and I don't think you found it yet." He went still. She opened her coat, which she'd hung on the chair, and took from the inner pocket a folded piece of paper. She set it on the table between them, not pushing it toward him, just placing it in the space between his hands and hers. He unfolded it. It was a printed photograph. Low resolution, security camera, still. It showed the hotel's West Service corridor, the one that had been blocked early in the incident, the one that Marcus had reported as inaccessible. In the photograph, the corridor was clear. And in the corridor, visible in the corner of the frame, were 2 people. One he recognized as Breck, the city councilman he'd been watching from the mezzanine before the lights went out. The other was a man he knew by a different name than the one on his summit credentials. A man named Garrett Cole, who was supposed to be in federal custody on a securities fraud charge since October. A man who 3 years ago had been on the wrong side of a negotiation with Adrian Voss that had not ended well for anyone. Adrian's hands on the photograph were entirely still. "Where did you get this?" he said. "From the fire department unit chief I spoke with outside." Her voice was unchanged. "He ran the West Wing response team. He found this in the backup server footage after the primary camera feed was cut. He brought it to me because he didn't know who else in the building he could trust." "Why did he trust you?" "Because I've funded his department's community outreach program for 3 years through the foundation," she said. "People remember who shows up consistently." She paused. "Unlike other things." The last 2 words were the only things she'd said that carried any edge. Everything else had been clean information, delivered without inflection. But those 2 words she let stand, and he let them stand, and they sat between them on the table alongside the photograph of Garrett Cole, who should have been in federal custody. "This means the attack had a specific target," Adrian said. "I think so." "Not disruption, not a power play by Reinhold or the usual opposition." He looked at the photograph. "Someone got Cole out and walked him into my event and used the chaos to—" He stopped. "To what?" Elena said. He looked up at her. What were they using the chaos to do, Adrian? Because I've been asking myself that since 2 this morning, and I keep arriving at the same answer, and I don't like what it tells me about who knew what. He felt the next sentence before he formed it, felt its weight in his chest, the weight of an understanding that was arriving from 2 directions at once and meeting in a place he hadn't expected. Garrett Cole in the West Corridor. The corridor that had been blocked first. The corridor that led to the hotel's secure document storage. The room where, at this particular summit, copies of every financial disclosure and registration filed by every attendee had been held in accordance with the event's regulatory compliance requirements. His financial disclosures. They weren't trying to hurt people, he said slowly. The smoke, the panic, it was cover. For access, Elena said. Yes, that's what I think. They were after documents. They were after your documents specifically, she said, and they used a building full of 400 people as the mechanism. He looked at her across the table. 12 years. He looked at her, and he was aware, with a clarity that the past 14 months had apparently obscured, of the specific quality of the mind across from him, the patience of it, the thoroughness, the capacity to move through a crisis and emerge on the other side holding something useful. She had gone from the ambulance to a conversation with the fire commander to a night in the Ashford apartment with a photograph and a hypothesis, and she had arrived at this table with more actionable intelligence than he had assembled in a night with Marcus and 2 analysts. I need that photograph, he said. I made copies, she said. You can have this one. He folded it and put it in his jacket. They sat for a moment in the particular silence of 2 people who have moved through something and are now on the other side of it, and finding the geography unfamiliar. Outside the Caldwell room's tall windows, the city moved in its afternoon patterns, oblivious, ongoing. Thank you, he said. Don't. Her voice was quiet and final. Don't thank me. I didn't do this for you. I did it because whatever they were after in that building is dangerous and loose in this city, and it has my name on it too, whether I wanted it there or not. He nodded. She stood, reached for her coat, and put it on with the same unhurried precision. She was leaving. She was going to stand up and walk out of the Caldwell room, and he was going to watch her go, the way he'd watched her go last night at the ambulance. And this time there was no smoke, no emergency, no operational crisis to give him a reason to follow. Elena, he said. She paused. She did not sit back down, but she paused. I know what I did last night, he said. I'm not going to... He stopped. I'm not going to pretend I don't. Good, she said. Don't. She left. He sat at the table with the water glass and the empty chair and the folded photograph in his jacket, and the awareness that he had, in the past 18 hours, made a series of errors with different weights and different consequences, and that the most significant one was not the choice he'd made in the ballroom, but the 14 months that had made the choice feel like it had any logic at all. His phone buzzed. Marcus. Cole's federal case. Check the arraignment date. Something's wrong. He opened the message and stared at it. Then he pulled up the public court records on his phone, found the case number, opened the arraignment record. Garrett Cole had been released on a procedural technicality 11 days ago. The case against him had collapsed on a suppression motion. The filing had been handled by a law firm that Adrian recognized, not because he'd ever worked with them, but because they represented, at arm's length and through careful documentation, the interests of someone who had been, until recently, one of his closest operational partners, someone whose name was in the network diagram he'd built last night, someone who had been in the ballroom, someone who, he now understood, had been watching him from the other side of an arrangement that had looked like loyalty and had been something else entirely for longer than the 14 months he'd been making his own mistakes. He set the phone on the table. He looked at the window. The city moved, indifferent and lit and full of its machinery, and Adrian Voss sat in the Caldwell room with the understanding that the attack on the Meridian Grand was not the beginning of something. It was the end of a preparation he hadn't known was happening, and whoever had been preparing it had been doing so with information they could only have gotten from someone inside his circle, someone who had been watching and waiting and timing everything for the moment when Adrian Voss would be standing in a panicking ballroom, making a choice that would tell the entire city exactly where his attention was and where it. The name on his phone screen was Donovan Reese. Adrian sat with it for 30 seconds without moving, without blinking, without doing anything except letting the name sit in his field of vision and mean what it meant. Donovan Reese, who had been with him for 9 years, who had run the eastern corridor of his operation since before Marcus had come on board, who had been in the ballroom the night before, who had shaken Adrian's hand at the top of the mezzanine stairs at 7:45 and said the event looked clean and that the security placement was solid and that Adrian could relax. Donovan Reese, whose name was attached through the law firm that had collapsed Garrett Cole's federal case, to a financial arrangement that had been running parallel to Adrian's organization for somewhere between 18 and 24 months. He put the phone in his pocket and left the Caldwell room without paying for the water. Marcus was parked on the service street behind the Four Seasons, which was where Marcus always parked when Adrian went somewhere he didn't want a car sitting out front. And when Adrian got in the car, Marcus looked at his face and didn't say anything, which was correct. "Reese," Adrian said. Marcus's jaw moved. A small motion, like something being swallowed. "How certain?" "The law firm, the Cole release, the timeline on the ductwork modifications." Reese signed off on the hotel's security assessment 2 weeks ago. He had access to the building schematics. He could have passed them. He passed them. Adrian's voice was flat, not loud. Flatness was what happened to his voice when he was past the part where volume would have been useful. He's been building a parallel structure inside mine for 2 years, feeding information, positioning assets, and he used last night to execute the document pull. He paused. He knew I would be distracted. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He knew about Vivian. Yes? And he calculated what you'd do when the lights went out. Yes. Adrian looked at his hands. They were resting on his knees and they were entirely still, which took effort he didn't let reach his face. He built the operation around my weakness and timed it to the moment that weakness would be most visible. He used me. He used 14 months of my mistakes as an operational asset. The car didn't move. Marcus was waiting for a direction. "Where is he now?" Adrian said. "His phone pinged off a tower near the Garfield Bridge 40 minutes ago. He's still in the city." "He doesn't know we know." "Not yet." "Keep it that way." Adrian finally looked up from his hands. "I need to talk to him before anyone else does. Just me. No team, no visible security. I need him to think this is a conversation, not a reckoning." "Adrian, I know the risk. You haven't slept." "I'm aware of that too." He reached for the door handle. "Set it up. Somewhere he'll agree to. Make it casual. Tell him I need his read on the Cole situation. That's true enough to land." He got out of the car before Marcus could object further and stood on the service street in the gray afternoon and let 2 full breaths move through him before he took out his phone and dialed Donovan Reese. It rang 3 times. Then, "Adrian." Warm, steady. The voice of a man who had been performing reliability for 9 years and had gotten very good at it. "Hell of a night. I've been trying to reach you all morning." "I know. I've been dealing with the aftermath." Adrian kept his voice calibrated, not warm enough to be unusual, not cool enough to signal anything. "I need your eyes on something. The Cole connection. Can you come to the Whitmore offices this evening, 6 o'clock? A pause of appropriate length, not too fast, not too slow. "Of course. You think Cole is the entry point?" "I think he's a thread. I want to pull it with someone I trust." The word trust dropped into the sentence the way he intended it to, carrying no weight at all, which was the weight it deserved. 6 o'clock, Reese said. "I'll be there." Adrian hung up and stood on the service street and felt something in his chest that he would not have called grief, but that occupied the same general territory. The specific desolation of understanding that a person you had trusted was not the person you had trusted, that the version of them you'd relied on had been a construction, and that every memory involving them now required re-examination. 9 years. He put the phone in his pocket and walked. He needed 3 hours, and he used them. He went to the Delmar Street house and showered and changed and ate something that Marcus's assistant had left in the kitchen, cold rice and protein that he consumed without tasting, standing at the counter. He reviewed everything the analysts had built overnight with Reese's name now running as the primary filter and watched the pattern restructure itself with the clean, horrible logic of something that had been true for a long time and was only now being seen correctly. Reese had been providing information to a consortium operating under Garrett Cole's original network, a group that had been building toward a hostile acquisition of the financial structures that underpinned Adrian's operation. Not a street-level takeover, not violence, something more sophisticated and more permanent, a document seizure that, combined with the right legal architecture, could be used to expose and collapse the shell structures through which Adrian's legitimate holdings were insulated from the less legitimate ones. It was not a move designed to hurt him. It was designed to own him, to take what he'd built and either control it or dismantle it at their choosing. And Reese had been the inside mechanism for 2 years. Adrian arrived at the Whitmore offices at 5:45 and dismissed the staff and sat in the main conference room with the lights low and waited. The room was on the 11th floor of a building he'd owned for 6 years, glass on 3 sides, the city visible in its evening transition, light going amber and then copper as the sun descended behind the western skyline. Reese arrived at 6:02. He came through the door the way he always entered rooms, solid, unhurried, carrying the particular confidence of a large man who had learned that rooms waited for him rather than the other way around. He was 51, broad across the shoulders, with a face that had always read as trustworthy, the face of someone's father or someone's coach, open and weathered and direct. Adrian had relied on that face. He now understood, been manipulated by it. "You look like you haven't slept," Reese said, pulling out a chair across from Adrian. "I haven't," Adrian said. "Sit down." Reese sat. He looked around the room briefly, noting the absent staff, the low lighting, the fact that Marcus wasn't present. And something behind his eyes made a small adjustment, fast enough that most people would have missed it. Adrian didn't miss it. "Where do you want to start?" Reese said. "Garrett Cole," Adrian said. "Tell me what you know about his release." "Procedural collapse on the suppression motion. I heard about it this morning. Looks like the prosecution overreached on the evidence collection." "Which law firm handled the motion?" A beat. Shorter than a normal processing pause. Longer than it should have been for a man who'd had all morning to prepare his positions. "I'd have to check. Drummond and Solis, I think. Why?" "Drummond and Solis represent a holding company called Veritas Capital Management," Adrian said. "Through a subsidiary called Northline Partners, Veritas has a capital relationship with a financial consulting firm called Crestbridge Advisory." He paused. "Crestbridge Advisory is where you maintain a private account under your mother's maiden name. It's been receiving transfers of between $40,000 and $80,000 quarterly for 22 months. The room was absolutely still. Reese's face did something that Adrian watched with the attention of a man who understood that what happened in the next 30 seconds mattered. The face moved through 3 distinct phases. The first was a micro-expression of shock, genuine and unguarded. The second was the rapid construction of a response. And the third was the choice, the visible, almost architectural choice, to abandon the response and go somewhere else. He leaned back in his chair. "How long have you known?" Reese said. 24 hours for the structure, 48 minutes for your name." "Elena." "Don't put this on her," Adrian said. "I'm not putting anything on anyone." Reese's voice had changed completely. The warmth was gone. What was underneath the warmth was not what Adrian had expected. Not aggression, not defensive calculation, but something that looked horrifyingly like relief. "I'm just noting that she's the one who moved the fire commander's footage. She was the one who connected the document storage angle. You wouldn't have found the Cole link for another day without her." "You engineered this around my distraction," Adrian said. "My specific, predictable distraction." "Yes." The admission was clean and immediate, and it hit Adrian in the solar plexus with the force of something he hadn't prepared for, which was the absence of denial. He'd prepared for a fight. He hadn't prepared for a man who was done performing. "Why?" Adrian said. Reese looked at him across the table, 9 years across the table, and the look was the most honest one Adrian had ever received from him, which was the worst possible version of this moment. "Because you've been building something that was going to collapse," he said. "Not because of Reinhold, not because of the external opposition, because of the internal rot. You stopped making decisions 2 years ago. You started making reactions, and the people who were watching you saw that before you did. So you sold me out. I positioned for what comes after. That's the same thing." "It's not." Reese leaned forward. His hands came to the table, deliberate, like a man making a formal presentation. "Cole's group doesn't want your operation destroyed. They want it restructured under management that isn't compromised by—" He paused, and the pause was careful. "Personal instability. Say it plainly. They want someone who doesn't make choices based on whoever's in his bed." Reese's voice was even, no heat in it, the calm of a man who had made his decision long ago and was simply now explaining it. "The Vivian situation compromised 6 separate security protocols over 14 months. 3 of your own people identified it as a liability flag. No one told you because no one could tell you." "You could have told me." "I tried," Reese said, 18 months ago, in the Garfield office. You told me to manage my own lane." Adrian was quiet. He remembered the conversation. He remembered it with the sudden, nauseating clarity of a thing that you'd filed incorrectly and were now finding in the right drawer. Reese had come to him with concerns about operational security and personal overlap. Adrian had interpreted it as Reese overstepping and had said so. He had then closed the conversation and moved on. He had closed the conversation. "That doesn't justify," Adrian started. "No," Reese said. "It doesn't justify anything. I'm not asking you to justify it. I'm explaining the sequence." He sat back. "What happens now is your choice. Cole's group has the documents from the hotel. Not all of them. They got interrupted before the full pull. But enough. Enough to start a process that you cannot stop from the outside." "What do they want?" "A meeting, 48 hours. You come to the table and you agree to a restructure, or they take what they have to the federal office and the process starts without your cooperation." Adrian looked at him. "And you," he said. "What do you get?" "A position in what comes after." Reese met his eyes. "I'm telling you this because 9 years means something to me, even if the last 2 years suggest otherwise. And because I think you're capable of making the right decision if someone gives you accurate information, which no one has been doing." "You have 40 seconds to get out of this building," Adrian said. Reese looked at him. "Adrian, I'm not going to do anything to you. I'm not going to have you touched." Adrian's voice was very quiet and very clear, each word placed with precision. "Because you're right that 9 years means something, and because what you did doesn't require my violence to have consequences. But you need to leave this building in the next 35 seconds because I need you not to be in my eye line." Reese stood. He straightened his jacket with the same unhurried motion he brought to everything, and Adrian watched him do it and felt the full distance between who this man had been in his understanding and who this man actually was, and the distance was enormous and untraversable. "The 48 hours starts now," Reese said. "Think carefully." He left. Adrian sat in the empty conference room for a long time after the door closed. The city outside the windows had gone fully dark, the evening light replaced by the fixed illumination of 10,000 buildings, the grid of it steady and indifferent. He sat, and he breathed, and he let what had happened settle into him without trying to resolve it into anything manageable. Donovan Reese had been working against him for 22 months. Cole's group had his documents. He had 48 hours before the architecture of everything he'd built became the instrument of its own dismantling, and he had made it easy for them. He had made it easy by being exactly what Reese had described, a man making reactions instead of decisions, a man whose personal life had become a liability flag that 3 separate members of his own team had identified and none had been able to address, because he had, 18 months ago, closed a conversation that needed to stay open. He pulled out his phone. He called Marcus first. He gave him the full account of the Reese conversation in precise sequence, no editorializing, just the facts in order. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was unusual, and when Adrian finished, Marcus was quiet for 4 seconds. The documents they pulled, Marcus said. How much exposure? Enough to start a process, not enough to finish one. They need my cooperation or they need more time, and they don't have more time or they would have waited for the full pull. So they're not as strong as Reese made it sound. They're strong enough to make the threat real, not strong enough to make it inevitable. Adrian stood and moved to the window. The city at night from 11 floors up looked like a circuit board, everything connected to everything by channels of light. I need Elena. A pause. She's at the Ashford. I know where she is. I need to know if she'll take a call. Another pause. Longer. I'll find out. He waited. He stood at the window and waited, and the city moved below him in its ordinary patterns, commerce and transit, and the 10,000 small urgencies of people living their lives inside the machine of a city that didn't particularly care which specific people were in it. His phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. She'll take it. He dialed. She answered on the second ring. Adrian? I know it's late to ask for anything, he said. Ask. He told her about Reese. He told her about Cole's group and the documents and the 48 hours. He told her without the editorial layer he'd used with Marcus, with less structure and more of the raw facts as they sat in him, which was not how he normally spoke to anyone, but which felt, in this moment, like the only register that was honest enough to deserve her attention. When he finished, she was quiet. The documents they have, she said. Which filing series? The Series D disclosures and the Meridian Properties Registration Cluster. I know those filings, she said. I helped structure them. He absorbed this. Of course she did. Elena had spent 12 years operating inside his world with her eyes fully open, and he had spent parts of those 12 years being grateful for her intelligence and other parts taking it as a given, and he was now in the position of a man who had treated a structural wall as decorative. There's a deficiency in the Series D filing, she said slowly. He could hear her thinking, the quality of the silence on the line. A procedural deficiency that was intentional. It creates an authentication burden on anyone trying to use those documents as evidence. They'd need the original signatory to validate the chain of custody, and the original signatory is a notary who died in March. That slows the process. It more than slows it. It creates a 6 to 9 month authentication gap, minimum, long enough to restructure the exposure if you move immediately. She paused. But you'd need to move immediately, tonight. What do I need? The Crestbridge connection Reese described. If that's the financial conduit, there's a way to collapse it from the inside using the Northline Partners subsidiary structure. It requires access to the original incorporation documents for Northline, which are held at the Caldwell County Clerk's office. Another pause. And it requires someone with standing to file a competing claim on the Veritas Capital position. Who has that standing? I do, she said. Through the Foundation's investment charter. I structured it that way in year 3 of our marriage, for exactly this kind of situation. The apartment's silence on her end carried the particular weight of an empty room, and Adrian stood at his conference room window 11 floors up and understood something with a completeness that had been building since the ambulance and the Caldwell room and the folded photograph. Elena had not been simply surviving inside his world. She had been building contingencies for every possible version of how it might go wrong, quietly, with the thoroughness she brought to everything, without telling him, without needing his approval, and without, apparently, requiring anything from him at all. Elena, he said. Don't. Her voice was gentle and immovable. Whatever you're going to say, don't say it tonight. Tonight we deal with the immediate problem. And after tonight, a long pause. Ask me after tonight. Will you help me? The question was smaller than the ones underneath it. They both knew that. She let it be small. Yes, she said. Meet me at the Ashford at 9. Bring Marcus and the Northline documentation. She hung up. He lowered the phone. The city blazed outside the window, and Adrian Voss stood in the dark conference room of a building he owned and felt the particular vertigo of a man who had just understood the full geometry of his situation. Not just the threat from Cole's group, not just the betrayal by Reese, but the larger shape of the 12 years and the 14 months, and the one night in a smoke-filled hotel when he'd gone up instead of staying, when he'd made the choice that had been visible to everyone watching, the choice that Reese had built an entire operational plan around, the choice that had announced to anyone paying attention exactly where Adrian Voss's attention was, and therefore exactly where it was not. He had one asset left. He had always had one asset left. He had simply not been paying attention to her. He was going to the Ashford at 9 o'clock, and Elena was going to help him, and he was going to have to sit across from her and receive that help and understand fully, without flinching, what it cost her to give it and what it said about him that he needed it. He turned from the window. He picked up his jacket from the chair. He was halfway to the door when his phone rang again, and the number on the screen was not Marcus and not Elena and not Reese, and he didn't recognize it, and in any other moment he might have let it go to voicemail, but he had learned in the last 24 hours what the cost of letting things go to voicemail looked like, so he answered. A voice he didn't know said, "Mr. Voss, my name is Carla Mendez. I'm a federal investigator with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division. I'd like to speak with you about an ongoing investigation into Veritas Capital Management." A pause. "I'm calling you directly because someone who has been cooperating with our office believes you may be a target rather than a participant. That person asked me to reach you before our office makes its next move." Another pause, shorter. "The person who asked me to call you is Elena Marlowe." Adrian stopped walking. His hand tightened on the phone. Elena had not spent last night at the Ashford apartment simply calling her attorney and building legal contingencies. She had been in contact with a federal investigator. She had given the fire commander's photograph to a federal office. She had been working, through the night and into the day, on a track that ran entirely parallel to everything Adrian had been doing, and she had said nothing about it at the Caldwell room, and she had said nothing about it on the phone 40 minutes ago, and she had scheduled a 9 o'clock meeting at the Ashford where she had offered to help him while already having taken a step that made the nature of that help considerably more complicated than it had appeared. "Mr. Voss," the federal investigator said, "are you there?" Adrian looked at the dark window. His own reflection looked back at him from the glass. A man in a conference room in a building full of his own documents, holding a phone, in the middle of a situation that was larger and more specifically constructed than he'd understood even an hour ago. "Yes," he said, "I'm here. I'd like to meet tonight, if that's possible, before 9 o'clock. Before 9 o'clock. Before the Ashford. Before the meeting Elena had set up, which she had set up knowing this call was coming, knowing that he would receive it and that it would land in him like a door opening onto a room he hadn't known existed, and which she had set up anyway because she had apparently decided to give him the opportunity to walk through that door on his own terms rather than have it opened from the outside. That was what she'd done. She had built him an exit and then called him to the door without telling him it was an exit, because Elena Marlowe did not tell people what to do with the options she created for them. She put the options in front of them and waited to see what they were made of. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass and understood that the next decision he made was not about documents or legal architecture or 48-hour deadlines from people who wanted to restructure what he'd built. The next decision he made was about what he actually was, underneath the 14 months and the bad choices, and the hotel ballroom and the smoke and the 11 minutes on the third floor, what he had been before all of it, and whether enough of that remained to be worth the effort of what came next. "Tell me where," he said to Carla Mendez. Carla Mendez worked out of a field office on the 9th floor of a building on Hargrove Street that had no signage on the exterior and a lobby that looked like an insurance company. She was 43, compact, with the kind of stillness that came from years of sitting across tables from people who were trying to decide whether to tell the truth. She had gray threading through dark hair that she hadn't bothered to manage, and she wore the expression of someone who had heard every version of every story and was waiting to find out which version Adrian Voss was going to offer. He arrived at 7:50. He came alone, which she noted. The room she brought him to was not an interrogation room. It was a conference room, smaller than the Whitmore office, with a table that had seen better decades and 2 chairs and a window that looked at a brick wall 8 feet away. She put a folder on the table and sat across from him and looked at him without opening it. "You drove yourself," she said. "Yes." "No security?" "No." She absorbed this. "Elena Marlowe said you'd either come alone or not at all. She said if you brought security, it meant you'd made the wrong decision, and I shouldn't waste my time." She tilted her head. "She knows you well." "Better than I knew," Adrian said. Mendez opened the folder. She turned it so he could see the first page, a network diagram printed in clean black lines that showed the full structure of the Veritas Capital constellation, with Northline Partners and Crestbridge Advisory and the law firm and Garrett Cole's original organization all connected by labeled arrows. It was more complete than what his own analysts had assembled overnight, considerably more complete. "We've been building this for 14 months, Mendez said, parallel to your organization, through Cole's network. We had Cole in custody to pressure his cooperation, and then something happened to the case." She paused. "Someone happened to the case." "Reese," Adrian said. "Donovan Reese engaged Drummond and Solis on behalf of an undisclosed client 11 months ago. The suppression motion was filed 30 days later. Cole was out in 72 hours. She turned another page. The Meridian Grand attack was Cole's team executing on 2 years of Reese's intelligence. They were going for a document seizure that, combined with the information Reese had already provided, would give them enough material to approach you from a position of complete leverage. "I understand the structure," Adrian said. "What I don't understand is what you want from me." Mendez sat back. Her hands came off the table. "Cole's network is larger than what's on that diagram. We have the Caldwell operation, we have the financial architecture, but there are connection points in 2 other cities that we haven't been able to map. Reese has the information, but Reese is negotiating his own position, and he'll take 6 months minimum." She held his gaze. "You have the information. You've been running parallel operations to Cole's network for 4 years without knowing it, which means you've intersected with their structure repeatedly, and you know things you don't know you know. You want cooperation. I want a conversation, 48 hours of documented conversation." She paused. "In exchange, the documents Cole's team pulled from the Meridian Grand go into federal custody, which removes them from Cole's leverage position entirely. The Northline Partners structure gets frozen through an emergency asset preservation order, which neutralizes their legal angle. And your organization's existing exposure gets examined through a lens that distinguishes between what you built and what was built around you without your knowledge." Adrian looked at the diagram on the table, the lines and arrows. 9 years of Reese, 22 months of transfers to an account under his mother's maiden name. "You're offering me a way out," he said. "I'm offering you a way through," Mendez said. "There's a difference. A way out means this goes away. A way through means you deal with what's real and come out the other side having dealt with it." She closed the folder. "Elena Marlowe has been talking to my office for 3 weeks. She came to us with the Foundation's investment charter and the Series D deficiency analysis, and a very specific theory about Reese's role that turned out to be accurate. She didn't do that to protect you." Mendez's voice remained entirely level. "She did it because the alternative was watching this detonate and taking collateral damage she hadn't chosen. But she built it in a way that gives you the option to make a different choice than the one you made 2 nights ago." The brick wall outside the window was indifferent and close. Adrian looked at it. "When do we start?" he said. "Now," Mendez said, and opened a second folder. They worked for 4 hours. Adrian talked, and Mendez's colleague, a younger man named Taft, who hadn't introduced himself but had a recorder and a legal pad, wrote things down in a shorthand Adrian couldn't read. Adrian talked about the intersection points with Cole's network that he'd cataloged without knowing what he was cataloging. The 3 property deals in the Eastern Corridor that had always felt marginally wrong. The financing arrangement in year 2 that had come through a channel Reese had recommended. The personnel hire 18 months ago that he'd approved on Reese's endorsement and that he now understood was an insertion. He talked with the precision of a man who had always maintained a detailed internal map of his own operation. And as he talked, he heard the shape of what had been done to him from the inside. And the shape was meticulous and patient, and had taken someone who knew him very well indeed. At 11:40, he walked out of the Hargrove Street building and stood on the sidewalk in the cold and called Marcus. "It's done," he said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What's done?" "The federal angle. I cooperated. 48 hours of documentation starting tonight." He heard Marcus exhale. Not surprise, but the release of something held. "Get Reese. Bring him somewhere contained. He's not to leave the city." "On what basis?" "On the basis that I'm asking. He'll know why." "And Cole?" "Cole is federal now. We step back from Cole entirely. He paused. Marcus, get everyone home. Pull the external teams. Pull the street-level coverage. Everything goes dark tonight. Adrian, it's over. That version of it is over. He looked up at the building's blank exterior. We'll talk tomorrow. Go home. He hung up. He stood on the sidewalk for 30 seconds, feeling the cold move through his shirt. He'd left his jacket in the conference room and hadn't gone back for it. And then he got in his car and drove to the Ashford. It was 12:20 when he knocked on the door of the 14th floor apartment. Petra answered, looked at him with the expression she'd always used, which was the expression of someone filing information without comment, and stepped back to let him in. The apartment was smaller than their primary residence and more real. It had bookshelves with actual books in them, and a desk that was actually used and kitchen counter space occupied by the machinery of someone who cooked. He had not been in this apartment in 4 years. He had forgotten it looked like somewhere a person lived. Elena was at the desk. She was in different clothes than the Caldwell room. Dark trousers, a gray shirt, her hair loose. And she had a cup of something that had gone cold beside her keyboard. She turned when he came in and looked at him the way she'd been looking at him since the hotel, with that specific inventory-taking clarity. But something in the quality of it was different tonight. She looked tired. That was the difference. Not broken, not diminished. Elena did not diminish. But tired in the way that honest exhaustion looked. The kind that came from 3 weeks of carrying something heavy without letting it show. You talked to Mendez, she said. 4 hours. Did you give her the Eastern Corridor intersections? All of them? She nodded. She turned back to the desk for a moment and closed something on the screen. Then she stood up and turned to face him fully, and the distance between them in the apartment was about 12 feet, and neither of them moved to change it. You built a contingency, he said, for this specific scenario. I built it for several scenarios, she said. This one happened to be the one that activated. How long? The Foundation Charter was structured in year 3. The federal contact was 3 weeks ago. She paused. I've been watching the Reese pattern for 8 months. The Crestbridge transfers showed up in Foundation-adjacent financial monitoring I run quarterly. I didn't have the full picture until the hotel. 8 months. She had been carrying 8 months of a developing threat picture and had said nothing to him, and he understood now that her silence had not been withholding. It had been waiting. Waiting to see if the situation would resolve, waiting to see what he would do, and perhaps waiting to see what she would do with the information she had about him that extended beyond Reese and Cole and network diagrams. Elena, he said, I need to say something. Adrian, please. He almost never said please. She registered it. He saw her register it. Let me say it. She was quiet. She stood with her hands at her sides, not crossed, not braced, just present, with the particular quality of attention that had always been one of the things he'd most respected about her and least deserved recently. I made a choice in that hotel, he said. I made it fast and I made it wrong, and I've been processing the reasons for that for 2 days. And the most honest thing I can tell you is that the reasons don't justify the choice. They explain it, which is different. He held her gaze. I went up. You were in the smoke, and I went up to someone else, and you were standing when I found you, because you didn't need me to come back. You'd already handled it. He stopped. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Not that I went up, that you were already standing. Something moved in her face, small and controlled, but real. I want you to know that I understand what that means, he said. What it took to be standing, and I understand that I'm the reason it took that. She looked at him for a long moment. Sit down, she said. He sat on the couch. She remained standing, which put her slightly above him, and he accepted that arrangement without adjustment because it was accurate. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to hear it without defending yourself. Okay. I knew about Vivian at 6 months, she said. Not the name, the fact. She watched his face. I chose not to confront it because I needed to understand what it meant before I acted on it, and because I had built too many things inside your structure that required my continued presence to remain stable. A pause. That's a cold thing to say. I'm saying it anyway because it's true. My reasons weren't only about love, they were also about architecture. He didn't move. I stayed because I had things to protect, she said. The foundation. The people whose arrangements ran through me, and yes, because I loved you and because love is not a switch, and because I needed time to figure out what I was willing to do with a situation I hadn't chosen. She looked at him directly. I am telling you this because you were honest with me just now, and I am not going to receive your honesty without giving you mine. I hear you, he said. I'm not finished. I know. She moved to the chair across from the couch and sat. They were level now, both seated, the 12 feet reduced to 6. The federal arrangement I built with Mendez, it protects the foundation's assets and it neutralizes the coal leverage position. It also creates a structure within which your organization's exposure can be managed if you choose to manage it in a particular direction. She paused. That direction is significantly smaller than what you currently run. Leaner, legal, or close enough to legal that the distinction stops mattering. It means dismantling the parts that can't survive examination. I know. Does that... She stopped, rephrased. What does that mean to you? It means I should have done it 3 years ago, he said. She looked at him. The size of it, he said. The scope. I've known for 3 years that the outer structure was more weight than the core could carry without the kind of rot that lets a Reese happen. I knew it, and I didn't act on it, and I told myself it was because of complexity, because of the people depending on the structure, because dismantling things always costs more than building them. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, hands loose between them. But the real reason is that I built my whole sense of what I was around the size of it, and I didn't know who I was if the size changed. 12 feet, 6 feet. Now the distance between them was just the coffee table and whatever 12 years had left in the air. Who are you without it? She said. Not a challenge. A real question asked in the register of someone who genuinely wanted the answer. I don't know yet, he said. I think I need to find out. Elena looked at him for a long time. The apartment was quiet enough that he could hear the city 14 floors below, the constant low frequency of a place that didn't stop for individuals. There's one more thing, she said, and this one is harder. He waited. Vivian Cross needs to be told clearly and finally that whatever this has been is finished, Elena said. Not because I'm asking you to end it as a condition of anything, but because she's been living in something she doesn't understand the full dimensions of, and she deserves honesty that she has not been getting. She paused. She's 22 months younger than the decision to build the Crestbridge account. She may not be as peripheral to the coal network as she appears, or she may be entirely uninvolved and have simply had the misfortune of 14 months with a man who wasn't being honest with anyone. Another pause. Either way, she needs clarity. And so does this. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to do it for me. I know that too. They sat with the quiet for a moment. Then something shifted. Not dramatically, not with the cinematic weight of a declared resolution, but in the small physical language of two people in a room adjusting their relation to each other. Elena reached for the cold cup on the desk and stood and moved to the kitchen to pour it out, which was a completely ordinary action, and Adrian tracked it with his eyes, and the tracking was not strategic or anxious. It was just attention. The specific attention of a man noticing where someone was. She ran the cup under the tap. Her back was to him. The Northline filing has to go in before 7 a.m., she said. I need 2 hours of work tonight, and I need you to confirm some dates and figures from your side of the structure. I can do that. Petra has the documentation in the second room. Go through the Series D cluster and mark anything that's inaccurate or out of sequence. She turned the tap off. I'll make coffee. He stood and moved toward the second room and stopped in the doorway. Elena. She looked at him over her shoulder. Thank you, he said. I know you told me not to. I'm saying it anyway. She held his gaze for a moment. The coffee will be ready in 10 minutes, she said. He went into the second room. The documentation was laid out on the desk in the precise, organized system that Elena used for everything. Chronological, cross-referenced, tabbed at the points that required attention. He sat down and started working through it, and the work was detailed and specific and required him to hold dates and structures in his head simultaneously. And he did it with the focus of a man who had spent 36 sleepless hours in a crisis and it arrived at 12:45 in the morning, at the part of the crisis that required something other than reaction. It required precision, it required care. It required the kind of slow, specific attention that you could not perform adequately if your focus was somewhere else. He worked. He heard Elena in the other room moving around, making coffee, opening a laptop. He heard the city below the window. He heard, very faintly, the sound of his own breathing, which was steadier than it had been at any point in the past 2 days. At 1:15, Marcus called. Adrian answered it quietly. Yes. Reese is contained, Marcus said. He came without resistance. He said, a pause. He said to tell you he expects you already talked to Mendez. Tell him he's right. He also said, another pause, longer. He said he's sorry, for what it's worth. Adrian looked at the Series D documentation in front of him, the clean columns of figures, the architecture of something built carefully over time. It's worth something, he said. Not enough, but something. He paused. Get some sleep, Marcus. Tomorrow's going to require everyone functional. He ended the call and went back to the documentation. At 2:30, Elena came into the second room with 2 cups of coffee and set one beside his elbow without comment, and stood looking at the spread of documents for a moment. Series D cluster is clean, he said. The inaccuracy is in the Meridian Properties registration. The date of the initial asset transfer is wrong by 8 days. I don't know if that was intentional. It was mine, she said. It was intentional. She picked up the page and looked at it. 8-day discrepancy creates an authentication question that has to be resolved before the documents can be used as primary evidence. Same principle as the notary issue. She set it back down. I built those in over the last 3 years, small things. Nothing that would affect ordinary operations, but everything that would slow down a hostile document seizure. He looked at her. You've been fortifying the architecture, he said. Yes. For 3 years. For 3 years. She picked up her coffee. I told you my reasons for staying were not only about love. Part of my reason for staying was that I needed time to build adequate protection into every structure that carried my name, so that when and if it became necessary to separate from the structure, I could do so without... She stopped. Without being destroyed by it. And without leaving the people inside it without protection either. He sat with that. You were building an exit, he said. I was building options, she said. An exit is one of them. She met his eyes. I have not decided which option I'm taking. The room was very quiet. That's fair, he said. It's not about fair, she said. It's about what's true. And what's true is that I don't know yet. 2 days is not enough time to know. She paused. What I know is that there is work to do tonight, and we are going to do it. And what comes after the work is a separate question. He nodded. She went back to the main room. He picked up his coffee and sat for a moment before returning to the documentation, and as he sat, he was aware of the specific quality of the apartment around him, the realness of it, the lived-in texture of a space that Elena had maintained as her own for 12 years while he'd been building and expanding and accumulating, the space she'd kept as the place that was in her name and not his. He understood it now as an act not of distance, but of survival. She had kept a room that was hers. She had kept it furnished and functional and ready. She had built into every structure that touched her life a series of small protections that could not be dismantled from the outside. She had been for 3 years building for the possibility that he would not be who she needed him to be. And she had been right to build it. And she had not yet decided whether the person currently sitting in her second room at 2:30 in the morning, working through documentation with coffee going cold beside him, was enough of a different thing from the person who had made all those protections necessary. He picked up the next document. He worked. At 4 a.m., Elena came to the doorway and said, The Northline filing is ready. I need your signature on 3 points in the asset preservation claim. He stood and followed her to the main room, and she laid the documents on the desk and pointed to the signature lines, and he signed where she indicated, his signature the same it had always been, a thing that was still his in a situation where very little else remained clearly his. She witnessed the signatures and countersigned and pulled the documents together into a precise stack. I'll file at 7 when the clerk's office opens, she said. Marcus should have someone there as backup in case Cole's people try to intercept the filing physically. I'll arrange it. Mendez needs to know the filing is happening at 7. She can have the asset freeze in place before Cole's team knows the North Line angle is closed. I'll call her at 6:30. Elena nodded. She put the documents in a folder and set the folder on the corner of the desk, which was where finished things went in her system. She stood with her hands at her sides again, in the quiet apartment at 4 in the morning, and they were 6 feet apart and neither of them was moving. "You should sleep," she said. "There's a room." "I'll be fine." "Adrian," her voice was quiet and direct, "you haven't slept in 40 hours. The next 12 hours require you to be functional. There's a room with a bed, and you should use it." She paused. "I'm not saying anything else by that. I'm saying you should sleep." He looked at her. He had looked at her across 12 years, and hotel ballrooms and conference tables, and now a small desk in an apartment on the 14th floor of a building where her name was on the lease. And what he saw at 4 in the morning with 40 hours of no sleep behind him was the same thing he had always seen when he bothered to look directly. Someone who was more than the situation they were in, who had been more all along, and who had spent years being underestimated by the one person who should have known better. "Okay," he said. He went to the room. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and his body announced, comprehensively and without patience, the inventory of what the past 2 days had cost it. His lungs still carried a trace of the smoke. His shoulder where he'd hit the hotel door frame had stiffened into a persistent ache. His eyes felt like they'd been cleaned with sandpaper. He lay back on top of the covers and looked at the ceiling. He was asleep in 4 minutes. At 6:15, his phone alarm went off, which he'd set without realizing he'd set it, some operational habit running below consciousness. And he was awake immediately, the way he'd always woken, fully and fast, no gradual return. He sat up. The apartment was quiet. He could hear movement in the main room. Elena already up, already working. He could smell coffee. He stood and checked his phone and found a text from an unknown number that had come in at 5:47 a.m. while he'd been asleep, 7 words. "The filing won't matter. We have Marcus." Adrian's blood went cold. He was through the door and into the main room before he'd finished reading it, and Elena turned from the desk with the expression of someone who had also just seen something, who was also holding her phone, and from the quality of her face he understood that she'd received a message too. "What does yours say?" he said. She turned the phone so he could see the screen. Hers said, "Bring Adrian Voss to the Garfield Bridge service level by 7 a.m. or the cooperation agreement with Mendez becomes public." 7 words and 15. The 2 messages together adding up to a situation that had just changed shape entirely, that had stopped being a documentation and filing problem and had become something else, something with a location and a time and his name in it, and Marcus somewhere in the city not answering his phone. 6:15 a.m., 45 minutes to the Garfield Bridge. Adrian looked at Elena and Elena looked at Adrian, and between them was everything that had been said and done in the past 40 hours. And the question of what came next, and what came next required a decision, and the decision required him to be something specific, something he had been building toward since the hotel ballroom and the smoke and the wrong staircase. "Call Mendez," he said. "Now. Tell her about the message. Tell her the filing has to happen regardless of what they're threatening. And Marcus." "I'll get Marcus." He was already moving toward the door, pulling his jacket from the chair back. "Elena." He stopped with his hand on the door. "File at 7. Whatever happens at the bridge. File at 7. She was already dialing. He went through the door at a run. The Garfield Bridge service level was not a place designed for human presence. It existed beneath the main span, a maintenance corridor of concrete and rusted iron that ran the full width of the river, accessible only through a locked gate on the North Bank embankment that the city's maintenance crews used twice a year and forgot about the rest of the time. Adrian had known about it for 11 years, since a meeting that had taken place there under different circumstances, when he had been the one with leverage and the city had been spread out below him like something he owned. He arrived at 6:41 with 19 minutes to spare and no backup, which was not a choice he'd made carelessly. He'd made it because showing up with visible force told whoever was waiting that he'd prioritize the confrontation over the filing, which was false. and false information in a negotiation was sometimes useful, but in this specific situation would tell Cole's people that the filing could be stopped, which it could not and must not be allowed to appear that it could. He went in alone. The gate lock had been cut. Recent. The metal edges were bright where they'd been sheared. He pushed through and moved down the embankment path in the gray pre-dawn, the river visible below between the bridge's concrete pilings, the water the color of old pewter, moving with the indifferent purpose of water that had been moving through this channel for longer than the city had existed. He heard Marcus before he saw him. Not words. A sound. The specific involuntary sound of someone whose breathing was being controlled by pain rather than intention. Adrian moved toward it, keeping his footfall quiet on the concrete, one hand trailing the iron railing that separated the service walkway from a 40-foot drop to the river. Marcus was on the walkway floor 20 meters in, sitting with his back against the outer railing, his wrists bound in front of him with zip ties, his face carrying the specific geography of recent violence. A cut above the left eye that had closed the eye partially, a jaw that was swollen on the right side, and the careful, deliberate stillness of a man managing a rib situation. His jacket was gone. His shirt was dark at the side. Adrian went to one knee beside him. "How bad?" he said quietly. "I've had worse," Marcus said, which meant it was bad. "3 of them. One's behind the third piling. The other 2 are back toward the gate." Adrian had already registered the man behind the third piling from the sound of his breathing when he'd come through. Slightly nasal, a smoker, the particular respiratory signature of someone standing still and trying not to make noise. He hadn't turned to look at the 2 near the gate because turning told them he knew they were there. "Garrett Cole," he said, still quietly. "Is he here?" "He's at the far end, past the mid-span." Marcus shifted and the rib situation announced itself in the quality of his exhale. "Adrian, the filing, Elena's filing at 7. Marcus closed his eyes for 1 second, relief moving through pain. "Okay. Can you move?" "Mostly. I need you to be able to move in about 4 minutes. He reached into his jacket and his hand found the small folding knife he'd carried for 15 years. The one that lived in the inner pocket by reflex, and that he had not reached for in 3 years because he hadn't needed to. He pressed it into Marcus's bound hands. "When I move forward, cut yourself loose and go back toward the gate. Don't engage the 2 there unless they move toward you." "And if they move toward me?" "Then engage them," Adrian said. "But go for the gate first." He stood up. He walked forward. The man behind the third piling stepped out when Adrian was 6 feet away, which was the distance at which stepping out made sense. Close enough to be physically present, far enough to have reaction time. He was younger than Adrian had expected, mid-30s, with the build of someone who lifted weights for utility rather than appearance. He had his hands visible, which meant he was either unarmed or wanted Adrian to think so. "Keep walking," the man said. Adrian kept walking. The service corridor opened slightly at mid-span where the bridge's structural architecture created a wider platform, a maintenance staging area with brackets for equipment that was no longer used. In this wider space, with the river 40 feet below on both sides and the city's pre-dawn skyline visible through the bridge's upper ironwork, Garrett Cole was standing. Cole was 61. Adrian had met him once, 4 years ago, at a distance and briefly, in a context that had not seemed significant at the time. He was shorter than Adrian remembered, or perhaps what he remembered was the size of the man's reputation rather than the man himself. Gray suit, no tie. The careful grooming of someone who understood that presentation was a form of authority. He looked at Adrian the way a man looked at a problem he'd been working on for a long time and was finally holding in his hands. Beside Cole stood Donovan Reese. Reese was not looking at Adrian. He was looking at the river, or appearing to look at the river, which was the body language of a man who had made a series of decisions and was now in the room where the consequences of those decisions were becoming concrete and findable he could not make himself look at directly. Adrian stopped 10 feet from Cole. "You didn't bring anyone," Cole said. "No." "That's either very confident or very stupid." "It's neither," Adrian said. "It's accurate." This isn't a situation that benefits from an audience. Cole studied him. The filing goes in at 7, regardless of what happens here. You know that, or you would have done this differently. Adrian held Cole's gaze. You brought me here because you want to negotiate, not because you think you can stop 7 a.m. Something shifted in Cole's expression. Not surprise, more the acknowledgement of a position being stated correctly. I want to renegotiate, he said. The federal angle complicates what I had planned, but it doesn't close every door. What doors do you think are still open? The cooperation agreement Mendez offered you is for 48 hours of documented conversation. After that, you're on your own. The document seizure from the hotel may be neutralized, but we have 14 months of Reese's operational intelligence that didn't come from the hotel. That material doesn't go away because of a clerk's filing. He paused. What I'm offering is a permanent arrangement. Not hostile, not an acquisition. A partnership, structured in a way that benefits both sides. You put chemical smoke into a hotel with 400 people in it, Adrian said, to steal my documents. The smoke was non-toxic. The risk was, there were 400 people. Adrian's voice stayed level. One of them was a 67-year-old city councilman with a heart condition. Another was a catering manager who fell during the crowd surge and broke her arm in 2 places. You built an operational plan around 400 people as collateral infrastructure, and you're standing here talking to me about partnership. Cole's jaw tightened. The risk was managed. The risk was to other people, Adrian said. That's not management. That's arithmetic. He looked at Reese. Donovan. Reese finally turned from the river. In the gray pre-dawn light, he looked older than he had in the Whitmore conference room. The absence of the performance had taken something physical out of his face, left it with the specific hollowness of someone who had stopped carrying a weight and discovered that the weight had been structural. You knew about the 400 people, Adrian said. It was not a question. Reese didn't answer immediately. Then, I knew the smoke was non-toxic. I was told the exit compromise was a secondary measure, that it would be Donovan. Adrian's voice was quiet and final. Don't explain to me. I'm not asking you to explain. Reese fell silent. I'm asking you to understand what you were part of. Adrian held his former colleague's gaze. Because I think somewhere in 9 years, understanding what something actually is matters to you, even when you've decided to do it anyway. The river moved below them. The city was beginning to lighten in the east, the first gray dilution of the dark, the kind of light that didn't yet commit to being morning. Cole took a step forward. This is a very considered performance, he said, but you're still here. You came to this bridge, which means you have something you want from this conversation. I want Marcus, Adrian said. Walk out of this city and leave my people alone, and I'll give you 24 hours before I tell Mendez about this meeting. That's not a trade. That's a delay. It's the only trade available. Adrian let that sit. You don't have what you came to the hotel for. The North Line filing closes the financial leverage. The cooperation agreement covers the operational exposure. What you have left is 14 months of intelligence from a man who is currently at a location known to a federal investigator, which means the clock on that intelligence is already running. He paused. Take the 24 hours, restructure your position. That's genuinely the best outcome accessible to you from where you're standing. Cole looked at him for a long moment. He had the eyes of a man who had run calculations at speed for 40 years, and Adrian watched him run them now, watched the processing happen behind the careful surface of his face. The Reese intelligence, Cole said. You can't make that disappear. I'm not trying to make it disappear. I'm trying to make it irrelevant. Adrian paused. The organization Reese was reporting on doesn't exist in the same form anymore. It started changing the night of the hotel. By the time your lawyers build a case around 14 months of intelligence, the structure it describes will be historical. Silence. The man at the third piling was still standing there. The 2 near the gate had not moved, which meant Marcus had not moved toward the gate yet, which meant Marcus was waiting to see how this resolved. Cole said, Reese stays with me. Reese's head came up. That's Reese's choice, Adrian said. He looked at Reese again. Reese was looking back at him, and in the look was the full weight of 9 years and 22 months of parallel motion, and a bridge at dawn, and a man who had spent the night in whatever contained location Marcus's people had put him, and had still ended up here, which meant Cole's people had gotten to him between then and now, which meant the containment had not held, which meant there were more threads in this than Adrian had accounted for. "Donovan," he said, "walk away from him." Reese looked at Cole. Cole looked at Reese. Something passed between them in that look. Not loyalty, not quite, but the particular bond of people who have committed to something together and are now measuring whether the commitment still holds in changed circumstances. Adrian watched it and waited. Reese took one step to the left, then another. He moved away from Cole's side with the deliberate, effortful motion of someone moving against a current that wasn't physical, and he came to stand in the space between the two men. Equidistant, which was not a declaration, but was the closest thing to one that Reese apparently had left. Cole's face went cold. "The 24 hours," Adrian said to Cole, "starting now." Another long moment, then Cole straightened his jacket with the precise, unhurried motion of a man recalibrating his position without acknowledging that he's doing it. "This isn't finished," he said. "I know. My organization has a longer memory than a federal agreement." "Most organizations do," Adrian said. "That's why they build things that outlast individual conflicts." He held Cole's gaze. "Go." Cole went. He walked back toward the embankment path with the man from the third piling falling in beside him, and they moved away down the corridor without looking back, and the sound of their footsteps faded into the concrete and the river noise until there was nothing. Adrian turned to Reese. Reese was looking at the ground. "Marcus needs help walking," Adrian said. Reese nodded and moved toward where Marcus was without being asked anything else, and Adrian watched him go and felt the shape of the 9 years one more time, the full outline of them, with everything he now knew mapped onto everything he'd thought he knew. And then he let them be what they were, which was over, and moved forward. They came out of the bridge into the morning. The light had committed itself by the time they reached the embankment. The city was fully visible now, the skyline sharp against a sky that was moving from gray to pale gold, the kind of morning that arrived without ceremony and made everything look like it had been washed. Marcus walked with Reese's shoulder under his arm and didn't say anything, and Reese supported him without saying anything, and Adrian walked slightly ahead and his phone showed 6:58 when he checked it. 2 minutes. At 7:01, Elena's number appeared on his screen. He answered immediately. "It's filed," she said. He stopped walking. He stood on the embankment with the river behind him and the city ahead and his phone against his ear. "Filed and time-stamped," she said. "Mendez has confirmation. The asset freeze order is in process." A pause, shorter than most of her pauses. "Are you all right?" "Marcus is hurt, nothing critical." He paused. "I'm all right." "Cole?" "Gone. 24 hours before Mendez knows about the meeting. I'll call her now." "Elena." He stopped. He was aware of Marcus and Reese behind him, aware of the morning light, aware of his own heartbeat, which had been elevated since 6:15 and was now, gradually, beginning to find a lower register. "Thank you." A long pause on her end, then, "Come to the Ashford when you've handled Marcus." She hung up. He stood for another moment with the deadline in his hand, and then he put the phone in his pocket and turned back to Marcus and Reese and the work of the morning. It took 3 hours to handle the immediate requirements. Marcus went to a private medical contact who confirmed 2 cracked ribs, the eye cut, and bruising that looked worse than it was. Reese sat in the car while the doctor worked and said nothing. And when they were done and Marcus was taped and medicated and sitting in the back seat with the careful posture of a man managing pain, Adrian got in the front and looked at Reese beside him. "I'm going to ask you to do something," he said, "and I'm going to ask it once." Reese looked at him. "Everything you gave them," Adrian said. "I need it back, not to destroy it, to understand it. Every file, every communication, every operational note. I need to know the full extent." He paused. "Not for a countermove, for an accounting. I need to know what I built that was visible from the outside, and I need to know it accurately." "Why?" Reese said. "Because I'm dismantling parts of it, and I need to know which parts before I start." Reese was quiet for a moment. Then, "I can have it to Marcus within 48 hours. "Don't send it to Marcus. Send it to Elena." Something moved in Reese's face. Acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of a man recognizing a shift in where trust had relocated. Understood, he said. Adrian got out of the car. He stood on the street outside the medical office and let Reese drive away, and watched the car until it turned the corner, and did not know if Reese would deliver what he'd asked for or disappear, and found, with some surprise, that he could hold that uncertainty without needing to resolve it immediately. That was new. The capacity to wait. He called a car and went to the Ashford. Elena opened the door herself. Petra was gone. The apartment was quiet, with the particular quiet of a space returned to a single occupant, and Elena looked at him the way she'd been looking at him for 3 days, with the measuring clarity. But under the clarity now was something else, something that might have been the specific exhaustion of a crisis that had ended, the kind of tiredness that only arrived when you'd stopped holding yourself against it. She stepped back, and he came in. "Coffee's fresh," she said. He sat at the kitchen table. She poured 2 cups and sat across from him, and they drank the coffee in silence for a moment, which was the first silence between them in 3 days that didn't have anything urgent inside it. He looked at the kitchen, the bookshelves visible through the doorway, the desk with its organized stacks of things that had mattered urgently 12 hours ago and were now resolving into the past. "I have to talk to Vivian," he said. Elena held her cup in both hands. "Yes?" "Today, not because—" He stopped. "Not as a transaction, because she's been in something for 14 months that she understood as one thing, and that was another thing, and she deserves someone telling her the truth to her face." Elena nodded. "And then I need to start the process of dismantling the outer structure," he said. "Marcus will help. It'll take months. Some of it will be uncomfortable." He looked at his coffee. "I don't know exactly what I'm building toward. I know what I'm moving away from." "That's usually the right order," Elena said. He looked up at her. "You don't build toward something new from inside the old structure," she said. "You move out of the old structure first. The building comes after." She set her cup down. "I've been doing that for 3 years. It's slower than it looks from the outside." "What did you build?" he said. "For yourself? In those 3 years?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "The foundation? Properly. It was always meant to be independent. Independent funding, independent governance, not reliant on your structure for its continuity. I made it actually independent." She paused. "The Ashford. I furnished it properly instead of treating it as a way station." Another pause, quieter. "I rebuilt some friendships I'd let go thin during the years when being your wife was a full-time project." He held her gaze. "I took up a lot of room." "You did. No accusation, just fact. Powerful people usually do, and the people who love them usually let them, because love involves accommodation, and accommodation can look like support for a long time before it starts to look like disappearance." She picked up her cup again. "I felt myself starting to disappear about 3 years ago. That's when I started building." "I didn't notice," he said. "I know. I should have." "Yes." She drank her coffee. "But noticing other people requires a kind of attention that you directed mostly at your operation for a long time. It's not unusual. It's also not acceptable." She set the cup down with a quiet finality. "I'm telling you this not to allocate blame, but because you asked what I built, and what I built started with noticing that I was disappearing, and noticing required me to be honest about why." He sat with all of it. The kitchen was ordinary and warm, and the coffee was good, and the city outside the window was going about its Tuesday morning with complete indifference to anything that had happened in the last 72 hours, which was the correct behavior of a city, and which Adrian found surprisingly comforting. The indifference of things that continued was its own kind of reassurance. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is that you don't know yet." She waited. "Is there anything left here that you want to build toward?" he said, "between us? Or have the 3 years of building been building away from this?" The kitchen was very quiet. Elena looked at her hands around the cup and then looked at him, and he saw the whole weight of the question sitting in her face. Not the dramatic weight of a crisis, but the heavier, slower weight of a real thing that required real reckoning. "I don't know," she said. "That's the honest answer." "Okay." What I know is that the person who walked through that door this morning is different in some legible way from the person who walked into the hotel ballroom 3 nights ago. Whether that difference is permanent or sufficient, she shook her head slightly. I can't answer that yet. What would help you answer it? She was quiet for a moment. Then, time. Actual time, not proximity. I don't want you to be in my building while you're proving something. I want to watch from a distance what you do when there's no crisis requiring you to be different. She met his eyes. Change that happens inside a fire is easy to perform. Change that happens in ordinary time is the only kind that's real. How much time? I don't know. Months, more than months, possibly. She paused. I'm not closing a door, I'm not opening one. I'm saying the door exists and I'm not ready to walk through it in either direction. He nodded. He could accept that. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in possibly several years, and honesty at this weight had its own kind of value independent of whether it gave him what he wanted. The foundation, he said. If there are structures from my side that are still threading through it, I want to clean them out. Whatever you need from me to make it fully independent, documents, signatures, restructuring, I'll do it. Petra has a list, Elena said. It's 17 items. Some of them are straightforward. Some of them will require your attorney. Send me the list. I'll send it today. He drank the rest of his coffee. He sat for a moment in the ordinary kitchen in the ordinary morning and let the past 72 hours settle into him as something that had happened and was now past, not resolved in the way stories resolved, with clarity arriving and everything finding its correct position, but past in the way real things became past, which was messily and incompletely, and with several threads still loose that would have to be dealt with in the ordinary time ahead. Then he stood. I'll go, he said. Elena stood too. She walked him to the door, the way you walked someone to the door of your own place, which was to say with the ease of someone in their own space rather than someone performing courtesy, and he noticed that ease and was glad of it, glad she had a place that was hers in this way. At the door he stopped. He looked at her one more time with the full attention that he had spent parts of 12 years failing to give her. I'm sorry, he said, for the specific things and for the general pattern. I'm not saying it as a transaction. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you deserve to hear it said plainly. Elena looked at him. Her face had the quality it had when she was receiving accurate information. Not soft, not moved to easy emotion, but present and real, taking it in fully rather than filtering it through a response. I hear you, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not the same as forgiveness. He understood the difference and accepted it. He went out. The elevator came and he rode it down 14 floors and came out into the lobby and through the front door into the Tuesday morning of Caldwell City, which was cool and clear and going about its business at the normal pace of a city on a normal day. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. His phone showed a message from Mendez. Asset freeze confirmed. Cole's team is being located. We'll need you for documentation review at 2 p.m. And a message from Marcus sent from the doctor's office. A list of names. 3 people from the bridge team who were now identified and whose information was being passed to Mendez's office. At the bottom of the message, also. Good call on the filing. She did good. No name. He knew who Marcus meant. He put the phone in his pocket and walked. He did not have a car waiting. He'd forgotten to arrange one, which was the kind of operational gap that the version of himself from 3 days ago would not have permitted, and which the version of himself from this Tuesday morning was going to allow, because it was a 10-block walk to the office where he needed to start making calls. And 10 blocks was not a long walk, and the morning was clear, and he had been inside buildings and crises and other people's decisions for 3 days, and he wanted the simple, uncomplicated experience of moving through the city at the pace of someone who was going somewhere on his own. He walked. The city moved around him in its ordinary patterns. The delivery trucks and the coffee carts, and the people going to work with the focused purposefulness of people who had somewhere to be. He walked through it and let it be ordinary, and felt the smoke finally leave his chest with the next breath. The last trace of the Meridian Grand dissolving into the cool morning air of a city that had moved on, because cities always moved on, because cities were not interested in what you'd been. He thought about Vivian and the conversation he owed her, and how he would have it, directly, without managing her response, without protecting himself from the consequences of the truth. He had managed enough. It was the management that had built the problem, the careful architecture of avoidance, and the only thing he knew how to replace it with was the uncomfortable and effortful work of saying true things to people's faces and letting those things land where they landed. He thought about Reese. He did not know if Reese would deliver the files. He did not know if Cole's 24 hours would stay 24 hours or compress. He did not know the full shape of what the next months would require, the dismantling and restructuring and the legal process and the 17 items on Petra's list and the documentation review at 2 p.m. and everything that would follow 2 p.m. and keep following it for longer than he could currently map. He knew what he was moving away from. He was beginning, slowly, the way the light was slowly becoming actual morning, to understand what he was moving toward. It was not power, or not power in the form he'd built and held and nearly lost. It was something smaller and more specific and considerably harder to measure. The possibility of being someone that the people who knew him could trust to look directly at the things he had previously looked away from, and to stay looking even when looking was costly. Elena had said, change in ordinary time was the only kind that was real. He was in ordinary time now. He walked through the Tuesday morning of Caldwell City, 10 blocks, at the pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be and a great deal of difficult work ahead of him. And the city moved around him with its enormous and different energy, and the morning light came in flat and clear off the eastern buildings and fell on the sidewalk in front of him, illuminating exactly as far ahead as it illuminated and no further, which was, he was learning, enough. It was enough to see the next block clearly. He walked.